Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is the Corporate Services Committee. I'm going to read a statement. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternative formats and communication supports for council, standing, and advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. I will start the meeting by looking for disclosures of pecuniary interest. Seeing none, we do have a scheduled item for now at 12:30. It is an in-camera item related to interviews for the Eldon House Board of Directors. My intention is to proceed to that item because that is what the individuals who need to be here for that have been informed. When we proceed out of that item, if we've completed the interviews, we'd have a chance to make a decision, depending on the committee's direction, if they want to proceed with something like a ranked ballot. We have all that prepared. We could allow for the counting as we proceeded through the agenda, but I'll look to the committee for what decision-making process they'd like to use after we've completed the interviews, and then we'll proceed through the rest of the agenda as scheduled. So with that, I would look for a motion to go into camera for item 6.1. Moved by Councillor Kaibaga, seconded by Councillor Hillier. Any discussion? Okay, we'll do that on the screen.
Closing the vote, that motion's carried 5-0.
Just so people have an estimate of our time, we're conducting interviews. I anticipate we won't be more than 20 minutes or so. Okay, so I'll call the meeting back to order. As is stated on the public agenda, we were in camera for the purpose of interviews for the Eldon House Board of Directors. I can report out from that meeting that we have now completed the slated interviews for the Eldon House Board of Directors. We have 12 people who we ended up interviewing. It is a board of 9, and so this committee has been asked by Municipal Council to recommend candidates for the Eldon House Board of Directors. Now that we have that information as well, their applications in hand, I would look to committee for the process that they would like to follow for decision-making on this particular board. Councillor Helmer.
Well, first I'd like to suggest that we deal with it later in the meeting at 5.1. I know there might be some advantage to doing a ranking now and then allowing people time to tabulate, but considering the number of other things we got to deal with, I'd rather deal with the consent and the scheduled and the items for direction. I think that's going to take us to 1, and then we can deal with the apportionment of taxes and then come back to it. That'd be my preference.
I don't have any objections to that unless members of the committee do. Okay, we'll proceed with that way. So we'll deal with that item under deferred matters and additional business. Well, actually, we'll just deal with it down at the end after that because that's where it is in the agenda. And we'll proceed with the regular agenda. We have consent items 2.1 to 2.6. I wanted to ask colleagues if they have anything that they'd like pulled separately for discussion. Councillor Helmer.
2.1.
Anyone else? Okay, then what I'd like to do is look, 2.2, okay. Then what I would prefer to do, if colleagues are willing, is deal with items 2.3 to 2.6 as a group. And I'd look for a mover and a seconder. Councillor Hillier, seconded by Councillor Kayabaga. Any discussion on 2.3 to 2.6? Okay, seeing none, we'll put that up for a vote.
Closing the vote, that motion carries 5-0.
Okay, I'll put, so 2.1, Budweiser Gardens City approval of the Zamboni Capital Lease Agreement. Councillor Helmer, you were looking to have that one pulled?
Through the chair to our staff, the report was very helpful in explaining what has gone on, and certainly I don't really have a big problem with sometimes people are going to make mistakes, and then we can accommodate those, and I think we need to look at the substance of the issue and not be too hung up about the order of operations. But I remember back when we made the change to allow this sort of thing to be funded from this source, and I wonder, are we expecting to see more of this sort of thing where there's more and more capital leases that are coming forward for approval? And if this was a sort of a perfect world where everything went in the right order of operations, is this the kind of thing that would have come to us for approval in advance? Or is it something that staff or our delegated authority to deal with?
Through the chair, so I'm not anticipating that there will be other leases coming forward. The other leases, when these were originally made the amendments to the participatory occupancy lease, was specifically with some betterments that had come forward and were more of a new moving things forward as opposed to replacing. So this one, they have always had Zamboni leases right from day one. Because the current agreements did not allow them, the leases were paid and not recognized in this manner. So now with the amendments, they're able to bring this forward. So I'm not anticipating that there are extra ones that would come forward unless there was something new that they were looking to do, that they would be bringing that forward in advance to the city for approval. With respect to your other question regarding whether this would come forward, the agreement speaks to approval by the city in writing. It is not clear on exactly what that means. So to err on the side of caution, we brought that forward to ensure that there was a council endorsement.
Go ahead.
So I think with that commentary that I'm comfortable with approving the request. I'm a little concerned that some things that are operating, you know, will get reconceptualized as though they're capital expense, and then they start hitting the capital repair fund, which we need to make sure that the building itself, you know, the main infrastructure in the building is in good shape when we take it over. And so as long as we're not drifting towards more and more things being financed that way, structuring them as capital leases instead of operating costs, I'm okay with that. You know, the way that this is structured, more and more of the leftover money comes to the city, like a larger percentage over time. And I could see there being incentives to minimize the amount that might be coming this way. And one of the ways of doing that is to change the operating stuff into capital so that you can use another source of financing. So I'm just asking about it because I want to make sure that it's not going to happen in the future. I think having these particular Zambonis and having them as a capital lease is appropriate, and I'll support it.
Other questions or comments? If not, I have one question for our staff. Given what is in the report about the oversight, it also indicates that Spectra has updated their internal processes to ensure that any future capital leases that are required for building will be sent to the city in advance for approval. I just want to make sure, are you aware of their new processes, and are you comfortable with them given given the error, and that there's relative confidence that the new processes will capture anything in the future?
Through the chair, yes. So we do meet once a year. There's the executive committee that does go together. So that was brought forward at that time, and we have confirmed that they will. This certainly with this one, because of the intent of trying to keep the machines running, and they were given machines early, so that kind of led to the oversight. So we've made sure and had numerous conversations with them, and they're very aware of this and have guaranteed us they will not make this error again in the future.
Great. I don't have any further questions, so I would look for, this is for approval. I'd look for a mover and a seconder. Councillor Van Meerbergen, Councillor Kayabaga, any other discussion? Okay, we'll put that on the screen.
Use your microphone.
Yay.
Very suspenseful vote.
The motion is carried, and it will eventually say 5-0.
Thank you. The next item, item 2.2, which is the 2018 annual update on Budweiser Gardens. I know that there is an annual report attached. Councillor Van Meerbergen, you pulled this for discussion.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Brian Ohl and Spectra Management for once again giving us a very successful year. The fact of the matter is their part in this success is large, and I think from time to time they need to be thanked for their ongoing good work.
Great. Other questions on the report? Okay, I'd look for, this is for, to be received, moved by Councillor Hillier, seconded by Councillor Van Meerbergen. Any other discussion? Okay, we'll put that up on the screen, hopefully. The system is being very slow, so we're going to do one more vote. If it's not fixed, we're going to start, if the committee doesn't object, voting manually, because we're not going to wait a minute or two for every individual vote from now on. So, but we'll do this one on the system since it's processing now.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 5-0.
Okay, that passes. If there are no objections to them from committee members, I'm going to move to manual voting on the items, because that's, the clerk tells me this is not going to get better. It's been doing this all day. We don't do recorded votes at committee, so it's going to be, hands up. If there's something that you really want us to try the system again on, because you want to record the vote, we could try. But I think for expediency, I'm going to do most of the votes that are left. Unless someone's going to tell me this is going to go faster by manual. If the committee has any suggestions on that, I'm open to it. I'm just trying to make sure things move smoothly along. Councillor Helmer.
Wary of slowing things down by talking about how to do things in order to then speed things up. There are apparently only maybe four or so votes left, so it may not be an issue one way or the other.
I'll tell you what, as a compromise, anything we have significant debate on, we will take the time to have the vote on a committee. If we're doing things like approving the apportionment of the taxes, like, and there's no objections, we're just gonna vote that way if there's consensus. But I do appreciate the desire to have the recorded votes recorded properly, so we will take the time on the votes where we need to take the time to do that, given there's not that many left. Okay, have I talked long enough to get past 1 p.m.? I have, and now we can deal with the 1 o'clock scheduled item, which is the apportionment of taxes. We did one of these at the previous committee meeting. This is not a public participation meeting, but we do have the report in front of us, and we do allow comments from the public on this. I don't know if our staff have anything specific on this particular grouping. If so, this would be the time to speak.
No, there's nothing specific to talk on this one, no.
Then I would look to see if there's, so where we are now is the apportionment of taxes. This is all of those taxes that are suggested to be changed. This is the part of the meeting where if members from the public have a comment on the apportionment of taxes, we would listen to their comment before deciding on it. So is there anybody in the audience who's looking to make a comment on this particular report? No? I'll just give one more opportunity. Okay. There are no public comments on this. Is there any comments or questions from committee members? No? Okay, so I'm going to do this one just as a manual vote, that on the recommendation of the Managing Director, Corporate Services, City Treasurer, Chief Financial Officer, the taxes on the blocks of land described in the attached schedules be apportioned as indicated on the schedules pursuant to Section 356 of the Municipal Act 2001. Do I have a mover for that? Deputy Mayor Helmer, seconder. Councillor Hillier. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. The next item is our first items for direction. We have 4.1, which is the Grand Theatre's Municipal Accommodation Tax Funding Request. There is a staff report related to this item. We also have a request for delegation status, which the committee would need to approve to hear the delegation. It's probably appropriate to deal with that now so that those wanting to do the presentation, there's a PowerPoint if there's a presentation, so I want to give them some time to come down while our staff make any comments they want to make on their report. So is there anybody willing to approve a delegation request? Moved by Councillor Kayabaga, seconded by Councillor Hillier. Any discussion? This is to approve the delegation for today. No discussion. We'll do this manually too. All those in favor? None opposed? Okay, that carries. So whoever's doing that presentation, you can work your way down to the main floor here and we'll get everything queued up for you. While we're waiting for them, does our staff have any comments on the report that they have produced related to this? I know it's essentially a two-part recommendation, one related to the passing on the information on the request, the other related to future directions on improvements from this. Probably appropriate to comment on either one of those now if you have comments.
Thank you, through the chair. So just, I think, just from a general update, so before, at the time of writing of this report, the finalized budget for 2019 hadn't been completed yet. So the balances on page 61, where we have the estimated tourism infrastructure fund, is amended now to include $500,000 that is coming out of 2019 for the London Convention Center. So what that does is the estimated ending balance for 2019 would be 1.261 as opposed to the 1.761 that is there in millions. So that is certainly something that occurred as of last week. So we have that update that I would draw your attention to. Further to the other conversations, so this request had come forward because they're looking to do matching from the federal infrastructure grant that they have requested, as well as some private donations. So what I would suggest is that if council wish to support this request, that there are other funding sources that you could in fact consider rather than the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund, noting that the balance is now not sufficient in 2019, but would likely be sufficient to use the funds in 2020. So, but it will leave very little estimated for the end of 2020. So I think one of the things that we're looking at is, and this is where the Part B of the recommendation is, that until we bring forward a process that council can look forward to trying to determine how you wish to use these funds, notwithstanding that we have a bylaw that says what is appropriate, this would certainly qualify, as would the other funding sources that we've identified. But we intend on bringing forward a report that would lay out a couple of options for council's consideration on how you might use these funds and plan that funding out in the future through future budget submissions in our multi-year budget process.
Okay, so there's a bit of a two-parter to this one. So what we have is the Grand Theatre's request for the municipal accommodation tax. The staff portion of the report is to be received for information, but there's a delegation associated with that portion of it. The delegation, from my understanding, has nothing to do with Part B, so perhaps we can focus on the Part A now. Would committee like to hear the delegation at this time, or would you like to ask questions of our staff, knowing that you can certainly ask questions of our staff and we can debate afterwards? Delegation now? Okay. Is the delegation ready? I don't think you. So we're going to let you start your delegation now. I know you have a PowerPoint to set up, and so hopefully we've got that all ready for you. Yeah, so just a couple of tips on presenting in case you don't know. The microphone, only one of them can be on at the time, with mine as the exception. So if it gets into a point of asking and answering questions, I'll just remind you to turn the microphone off when you're done presenting. Traditionally, delegations are 5 minutes. I'll roughly time that. If it goes beyond that, I'll look to the committee for a time extension if needed. And it's really, the floor is yours to communicate what you're looking to communicate based on the request. So,
great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, Deb just got back.
No, just waiting for the rest. Thanks for the opportunity to speak about this exciting initiative by the Grand Theatre. My name is George Druhulis, and I sit on the executive board of the Grand. Today with me is Jamie Critch, Tom Tillman, Elizabeth Drulow from our board and from the foundation board, and Deb Harvey, our executive director, and Dennis Garnham, I believe, who's up there, our artistic director. A background of our request today: the Grand Theatre employs about 300 people throughout our season and pays about $4.5 million in salaries in the past 12 months, and we host about 100,000 visitors a year. The Grand Theatre purchases over $1.5 million in local goods and services, and throughout our 100 Schools project, more than 33,000 school kids from our community benefited from the work of the Grand Theatre. The Grand Theatre raised $130,000 last year for the food bank and donated about 750 theatre tickets to 375 local charities last season. Today, we're here to talk about a project to do some renovations to the Grand Theatre, and Tom's going to speak to those slides.
So this project that the Grand, it's a great project that they've got proposed. There's 7 elements to it. So I just want to briefly touch on the 7 elements that make up a total project cost that you're aware of, and you'll see it in this slide. So the first 2 pieces that you're seeing, the Spreet stage and McManus stage, it's really automation, it's lighting, and it's sound systems upgrades. Again, we're in a digital world where things are changing drastically, and the Grand, being a professional theatre, is raising the bar here in London. And so these 2 pieces of the project, which represent about 40% of the expenditure, are critical to the success of both those stages. The remaining 5 elements, we've been working on defining what those are for about the last 6 months. We've had the input of local contractors to assist in making sure we're coming forward with the right numbers. We've got building envelope and infrastructure requirements, and probably the highlight there is we've got a roof that's leaking. I mean, the Grand, as some of you may be aware, hasn't had any major work done to it in over 40 years. The building, original building itself from 1901, obviously is a treasure, and looking at something like roof replacement sounds very simple, but it's also critical for the Grand to survive. In the box office, there's a need there to update, automate, again, looking at the digital way that things are happening. There needs to be sort of an easier access for people to obtain tickets. We're looking at lobby space upgrades, again, trying to create a more welcoming experience for the guests and theater goers, opening up space within the building, so we're not adding new floor area, but we're finding ways to get more usable area in the building. Item 6 with the wardrobe and props, again, we're looking at infilling some open space in double height areas. It's quite an overcrowded condition that the folks there are working in, so one, for efficiency and also creating a safer work environment, that becomes a critical element of the project. And then with the artist spaces, again, it's been 40 years plus since anything's been done to those areas, and you know, we do have professional, high-class actors coming to this city, and we think it's important that they also have an environment that is in keeping with the work that they're doing. And so we've got a projected total project costs, and that's including construction, the purchasing of infrastructure, lighting, sound, permits, fees, furniture and equipment, all of those costs at $8 million. We've built in contingency into that, and we're quite confident that the $8 million is sufficient to do the project that we've defined. There were other things we wanted to do, but we prioritized, and so what you're seeing in front of you today is those priorities.
How we propose to fund this work is a $4 million federal government grant from Cultural Spaces. We have got a great review from them so far, and it's been very, very positive. We had $2 million in private donations, which are confirmed, and they're in place, and then $2 million from the City of London. So we're trying to work on this in sort of matching funds. As far as the timing is concerned, to meet our schedule, the grant would require a letter of commitment from the city in March. We don't need the funds right away, but to get the Cultural Spaces funds, we need a commitment from the city. And I think that's if you have any questions, we've got some people upstairs that can answer some of them too. So.
That's great. You were like exactly 5 minutes right on the dot. So
I knew it.
excellent timing. Well rehearsed. It's almost like you plan productions. So committee, we do have the delegates here. We have our staff here. I think it's appropriate to deal with the first part of this, the request, first. So I would look to the committee for discussion on this. If you have questions of anyone, also that would be appropriate at this time as well. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. Through the chair to the delegation. You mentioned the timing of the commitment in terms of the actual expenditure of the funds and when you need the funds. What is the rough timing for that?
If you could just turn on the microphone. People at home, hundreds of them are watching too, so they want to hear as well.
Understood. And if I make any mistakes, Deb Harvey, please correct me. So we're looking at a project start in 2020, sort of spring of. The season itself, in terms of the shows that are running, has been timed such that there's been sort of movement made to allow for the construction, sort of the heavier construction. Some of the things can happen outside of that work, like a roof replacement. That's not necessarily critical that it happen, you know, in 2020. It's something we'd actually like to get on now, but in terms of funding being needed, it will be 2020.
So I think, just for clarity, because I think Councillor Helmer is getting at the city's $2 million portion, you would not be looking to actually have in hand until 2020.
We'd take it sooner, of course. But yes, 2020 would do, it's, as George had mentioned, it's that letter of commitment that helps trigger the federal funding.
Councillor Helmer?
That's it for questions for now.
Other questions from the committee? If not, I recognize that there's some other colleagues here as well who may have questions. Okay. Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Perhaps I could ask staff, when is it that you feel you'll be bringing back the report on the accommodation tax fund?
Through the chair, so we're looking at the process probably late spring. So we're trying to look at all of the, multi-year budget is taking precedence to get moving on that, to get all the process ready to go. So that's our focus for the next few months. So we're not anticipating bringing anything forward likely till the end of May at the very earliest, likely more June.
So my follow-up question with our folks from the grant, to my way of thinking, we need to know more about this fund before we give commitments. And I'd certainly like to see the report prior to giving that commitment. Can you wait till June?
Maybe if I could ask Deb to talk about the funding from the feds.
That would be a no. And I'm assuming you can hear me. We need to get cultural spaces word to them. Obviously, municipal funding will leverage the federal funding. So in an ideal world, we would have a commitment from our city so we could take that to the federal government right away.
Go ahead.
The private sources of funding, their private donations, is that a mix of ticket holders and corporations? Do you have corporate donors in there?
Yeah, there's corporate donors, families.
Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much. I want to confirm that from my past involvement, although it isn't current as on the foundation board of the Grand Theatre, I understand how the cultural spaces component works. And to be able to leverage the federal government, you need to have the municipal government support, which we provided previously, but it does matter because the Cultural Spaces Fund is significant. And I think the Grand Theatre probably is the most effective of all of our associated groups in taking advantage of this funding. A question through you, Chair, to the staff, and that is this. I know we've had a lot of discussion around the issue of our hotel tax. And can you just confirm, notwithstanding the fact that we don't have a formalized policy as yet, we've done a couple of ad hoc supports, one of the convention center and certainly one associated with the Junos. But could I ask you over the 12-month period, what you anticipate the amounts to be, and then also tell us the amounts, just to remind us all, the amount that's been allocated, just to ensure that if this is the place, logically, that we would support a funding like this. I just want to be sure that there's sufficient in the fund, and I'll even take projected because I think that's legitimate based on what we anticipate, and it may not be exact, but I'll come with within $100,000. I'd be happy to have a number from you, Treasurer, please.
Yeah, I'll go to the treasurer on this. I just will note, because I know people have documents up there, that there is a chart in there. Our treasurer has provided updated numbers to that chart, which I believe she's going to go over now to be very clear so that based on other council decision making, what the actual numbers are in that.
So through the chair, so the chart that we've provided on the second page of the report, so page 61 in your agenda, shows that at the end of 2020, we were anticipating $2.7 million. Now, the only change that has occurred since that is that council approved the $500,000 to the London Convention Center. So that would reduce the projected balance by another $500,000. So we're estimating we'd have approximately $2.2 million at the end of 2020. So what that means is that essentially based on our estimates, which is only a few months so far, we're anticipating about $1.5 million annually going into the fund. The only thing I would add is that one of the things that I think is important to mention is that when we initiated the municipal accommodation tax and brought forward the bylaw. We also brought forward the bylaw for the reserve fund at that time, which was very clear on what kind of things were anticipated to be funded from that at the time. And one of them was tourism-related infrastructure that might increase venue capacity. The other part was where it could be used to leverage additional funds, which this is definitely a case where you could consider the usage of that. I think the only challenge with it is that because we aren't sure and it's not money in the bank already known at this point, is whether there might be potentially, if we had a shortfall in funds, that we might not have enough. So that's really the only concern at this time with this fund. I think when we had originally anticipated this fund being used, it was another funding source at council's disposal, just like any other reserve fund that we have. So it's up to council to apply the funding and based on our staff recommendation on what might be appropriate based on the bylaw that's already improved. So the process itself is really laying out some considerations for council on how you might want to guide the use of this fund in the future in terms of whether you even want to use it, just as an example, to have it as a community grants program. You may want to use the remaining balance after we've had some significant draws to fund some infrastructure that is driven by council themselves as we're looking at other expansions and things and potentially city facilities and or Budweiser Gardens, et cetera. So it's really up to council how you wish to ultimately use this fund, but we're happy to provide examples that might help you give a more stronger process on how you wish to use it in the future.
Mayor, are you good? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Because I guess the question is, and I think Councillor Van Meerbergen had some thoughts he's just shared with me, so I apologize for the interruption there, but the question might be the most appropriate way to support this. It has my support, but I'm wondering if there might be a couple of ways to do this, and I defer to Councillor Van Meerbergen if he had some questions, if that's appropriate, Chair.
Well, I have a speakers list, so unless Councillor Van Meerbergen, I'd like to proceed through that. There's only two people before you. So I have Councillor Lewis and then Councillor Helmer and then Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will stick to questions for now. When we enter debate, I might advise people I've just come from the Tourism London Board, so I have some comments to share with you from that group. But in terms of this particular item, I certainly support it. I think it's very to echo the mayor's comments, to use the Cultural Spaces Fund and to have that guarantee is critical, and it's very valuable for us to do. Through you to staff, I just want to make sure that my own math that I'm scratching out here on the back of my page is correct, because I know Ms. Barbone is far more talented at math than I am. So essentially what we're talking about is at the end of 2020, if we were to fully fund this through the municipal accommodation tax, in addition to the other allocations we've already made, we would be left with only a balance of approximately $200,000. Is that correct?
Ms. Barbone.
That is correct. Your math is very good.
261,000 actually.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Your math is better than mine. So my follow-up to that, and Ms. Barbone, you alluded to this in your comments, and I think this may get to the heart of Councillor Van Meerbergen's question as well. You mentioned that there may be other appropriate sources of funding. Is there a particular source of funding through you, Mr. Chair, to staff that they might recommend?
Ms. Barbone.
Through the chair, we would recommend, I think ultimately it's council's decision, but the other source that we feel would also be appropriate is the Economic Development Reserve Fund that would have sufficient funds as well. So you could do a balance from each as well if there was an appetite to ensure that you had sufficient funding in this. You could potentially split the funds as well, similar to how you've done some other funding for the Children's Museum as well. That could be something council could consider as well.
Okay, good. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. Hopefully, I have a way that's going to be supported by most of the folks. Sound like there's pretty broad support for the idea in general. So what I'd like to suggest we do is that we approve the request and that we say the first source of financing can be the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund. The second source of financing can be the Economic Development Reserve Fund. And we will direct our staff to finalize the sources next year when we know what the balances are, and they can look at the draws and the contributions and say, well, I think it's gonna be 200,000 and 1.8 million, or it's gonna be 400,000 and 1.6 million. We can figure that part out next year when we know more about the status of those reserve funds, the anticipated draws and contributions, but we can indicate now that we support the idea and that there will be $2 million from one or both of those sources of financing, and we can deal with the splits later. Because I think that's what everyone is concerned about, is what the balances will be. This one here is something that the money is not needed until next year. So I've sent a motion to the clerk that basically says that to approve the amount, to set out those two sources of financing, and to direct staff to finalize the sources of financing in Q1 2020, so first quarter next year, based on what we know then. Because I don't think it matters too much to the grant where it comes from. I think it matters a lot to us. We've had a lot of discussions around what's the appropriate source of financing. So I'll see if there's a seconder for that.
Okay, so that's looking to move that, but Councillor Helmer, I have the language. If anybody needs it read out, I can. Mayor, are you looking to try to second that?
Happy to second it, but I just have a question, if I might, whether this is just a friendly or it might well be in the wording, and that is the issue of the requirement that the Grand receive a letter of commitment to be able to allow them to access the cultural spaces funding. So as long as that's all part of it, I'm very delighted to second it.
Yeah, the motion reads as to be approved. I anticipate what our staff would do without any additional direction is to provide that letter of commitment as they need, unless, Ms. Barbon, you would need specific direction to provide a letter of commitment, assuming council approves this, obviously. I'm getting nods that would certainly be part of it, given that the request is to approve it. So you're willing to second that then? Okay, so we now have that moved and seconded. Perhaps, if anybody needs that read out at any point in time during the debate, I'm happy to do that. I think you're going to try to get it on the screen. We're going to get it on the screen. It might be a slow process, as you may have understood, so if you need it read out, let me know. We're continuing with the speakers list. There is now, though, a moved and seconded motion. Councillor Van Meerbergen, Van Holst, and Hillier.
Well, I was just going to add earlier, prior to this motion, that we look at a way not to overtax, quote unquote, the poor little hotel tax reserve fund. So I think this accomplishes it. So I can probably support that.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and also thanks to the Deputy Mayor. I think this is a great path forward. And this is one of those things that straddles economic development and tourism as well. So many people from London, they go to the play, they make a night out of it, they have dinner before, drinks after, and both. And so that's building up our downtown, and then we're drawing people in from the outside, because the Grand is breaking a lot of ground in terms of the plays they're doing. And I remember years ago seeing a wonderful production of The Rainmaker. And however, because of the leaking roof, I don't want to see them limited to those kind of meteorological performances. So I'm thrilled to support this, and I think they're doing a great job. And for us to be involved in this sort of matching and leveraging, I think is a model that we want to think more of as well. So we should think about this and see how we can apply that to other things or encourage it in other ways as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Van Holst. If colleagues on the committee who have their screens open, if you click current item at the top, you should be able to actually review the content of the motion now. I will say the motion is only referring to the supplanting part A in the staff report. We're not actually dealing with staff's recommendation to defer requests at this time. We're going to have that debate after this one, just so colleagues know. Councillor Hillier.
Thank you very much. Through the chair, I'm going over this motion. I'm very curious. When we took our tour of the Grand Theatre, one of the spaces that was pointed out was the two locations to the right-hand side when you're facing it. Is the ask for those properties included in this, or will there be a future ask?
That is not part of this request.
Will there be a future ask?
There's no plan at the moment that there's a future ask. This is the plan we have going forward.
You're finished, Councillor? Okay, I'm going to move on. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to say thank you, Councillor Helmer, for proposing this approach. I think that this works for now. I would certainly be concerned if this were coming to council and we were saying that we were gonna have a municipal accommodation tax that only had $200,000 left to get us all the way through to the end of 2020. I think this is a good compromise. I had the chance to take in a performance at the Grand recently, and then when I went over and toured and heard about the renovation projects, and I couldn't help thinking about the fresco art in the arch above the main stage, and that piece is original. It goes back to 1901. It would be a shame if we deferred this and had a leaky roof cause damage to that piece of our city's heritage. So I will support this. I do want to say to colleagues, however, as I mentioned, I just came from the Tourism London Board meeting, and I have in my hands here the agenda and the report. They've already been able to establish a vetting committee and a process by which requests for accessing their portion of the municipal accommodation tax, I'm just going to call it hotel tax, that's easier to say, how their portion of the hotel tax can be accessed. I think that's very encouraging that they've taken that step to put in a 5-member committee that will vet and then report on business cases to the board on how they expend their portion. Again, I say that it's very critical that we take the same look here, and I heard Ms. Barbone refer to maybe a community granting process. I think that that's something we need to consider because we are still spending money that we don't have in the bank yet, and that is a concern. So I think we do need to work to find a solution to that going forward.
Other colleagues? If not, I have some comments myself. I'll just make them from the chair if everyone's okay with that. So I'm supportive of the direction that Councillor Helmer has suggested. When I look at the chart and it moving out into the future, the fact that the money isn't needed until 2020 is actually an advantage. It gives us some time to, backstop the Tourism Investment Reserve Fund with the Economic Development Reserve Fund should we be in that situation. I will note that there's about 1.5 million of estimated contributions to that. I've known our treasurer to be conservative and careful in her estimations, and ideally we're in a situation where those are very conservative estimates and that we're actually in a better position, particularly with the Junos year in 2019. And we may find out in 2019 that we're actually in a position to finance this quite easily from the Tourism Investment Reserve Fund. However, that is not an assurance, and so I think it is very responsible for us to identify a full source of financing so that we can write the authentic letter of commitment and allocate the money fully from the sources that Councillor Helmer has identified in his motion. So I'm supportive of moving in this direction, and yeah, I'll look to see if there's any other committee members who have comments. Okay, if not, we can open this for voting. We're going to vote this one on the system. I apologize if it's a little bit slow. We have a mover and a seconder, so I'll open it up.
I vote yea. Closing the vote, the motion is passed 6-0.
Okay, colleagues, the next piece of it, so that passed. It still has to go to council, but thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have the second part of the staff report, which was a recommendation that further requests from the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund be deferred pending Civic Administration's report on a process for future allocations from the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund. Discussion on that, or a mover and a seconder for that direction? Councillor Helmer.
Based on what the treasurer said in response to, I believe it was Councillor Van Meerbergen, in terms of the timing of that report, I think I'm comfortable with that kind of approach. As long as we deal with it relatively quickly, I think that's good. If we leave it in abeyance for a long period of time, I think that would be, could be problematic. We could have a whole bunch of things piling up and not be aware of them. So I think I support that approach as long as it's within sort of by the end of the second quarter. The treasurer said sometime in spring, which is very soon. So I think it's going to be a good way forward, and I'll move that.
I believe the estimate the treasurer gave was, quote, the end of May, maybe in June. So that's the time frame we're looking at. So Councillor Helmer's willing to move that. Is there a seconder? Councillor Hillier. Discussion on this item, which is basically deferring pending any further requests for funding from this fund until we get the process for allocating those. No other discussion? Given the screen is frozen, I'm going to do this vote manually. So everybody knows what they're voting on? All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Item 4.2, which is future tax policy possible directions. There is a staff presentation associated with this item. So if committee is okay with that, I think I'd like to start with the staff presentation on our tax policy. And there's a digital presentation, so you can switch to your other screens if you like. And I believe we have hard copies for the committee as well. Sorry.
So through the chair, Mr. Ian Collins is going to walk you through at a high level. I think the presentation will kind of crystallize the details that are in a report and kind of tie all the concepts together and hopefully answer any questions that you might have.
Through the chair to the committee, as a precursor to the 2019 tax policy report that will be provided to committee and council in early spring, administration thought it would be prudent to accommodate committee and council with a little information session related to future tax policy as to what has been done in the past, as well as some general tax policy concepts. So when we take into consideration the property tax policy, we start off looking at the valuation of properties, which is a role played by MPAC. The second component is determining the amount of tax to be levied through the tax levy, which is determined through the budget process that was wrapped up on February 12th. At this stage, we find ourselves at computing the amount of tax to be collected for each property, which in essence is calculating the tax rate. And in order to do so, civic administration relies on a number of factors, such as reassessment, tax shifts, legislation, education rates, and existing tax policy. And the final part is collecting of property taxes, which is the final tax bill that will go out soon after council goes at or approves the 2019 tax policy. So there are two components or two policy components related to property tax. There's the assessment policy, which is how land is valued, and the tax policy, which is how the burden is calculated and distributed over the tax base. All impacts the taxpayer, and both are governed by the province of Ontario. With respect to the assessment policy, the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, MPAC, looks at providing the assessments of the values of property, and the Assessment Review Board, often heard as ARB, looks at appeals. On the tax policy side, the municipality sets the local policy. The property tax bill comprises of two components. The first is the education portion, which is set by the province, which looks at a uniform residential, multi-residential farmland classes, but the rates for commercial and industrial rates vary by municipality. The other portion, the municipal portion, which is what the 2019 tax policy report will be based on. So generally speaking, the municipal portion property tax bill is calculated by multiplying the tax rate multiplied by the assessed value. The tax rate can vary by the property classes. The policy is set by the province of Ontario as they set goalposts, and council sets the local policy within those goalposts. On the assessed value side, policy is set by the province, assessments are undertaken by MPAC, and the taxpayer may appeal to the ARB. So the first step in the process is council setting the overall budget, which sets out how much is to be raised in total from the tax levy. From there, we look at dividing that burden over the various property classes. It is important to note that the division of those burdens across the property tax classes is a zero-sum game. So to look at it from a visual standpoint, council sets the overall size of the pie. Through tax policy, council looks at how that pie is divided up. Through the annual tax policy review, historically, the city has been guided by 4 principles. Equity, whereas similar valued properties are treated the same. Economic development, competitive, comparable with other major centers. Transparency, the taxation system is understandable to the taxpayers. And finally, administrative efficiency. It's simple and cost-effective. Keeping all that in mind, there's a lot of variables, as mentioned earlier, that go into setting the tax policy. There's the impact of reassessment, that we're still working through the 2016 reassessment. The municipal tax levy, which council just set the budget. The education tax rates, provincial regulations, and then the detailed calculations that go into bringing all those numbers together. So where have we come from over the years? Back in 2011, council set the following objective. Wanted us to lower and equalize the tax ratios for multi-residential and industrial to an equal ratio as commercial. In 2013, administration was able to reduce the multi-residential tax ratio. In 2014, both the multi-residential and industrial tax ratios were reduced, with multi-residential finally equaling commercial. And by 2015, the industrial ratio equalized to the multi-residential and commercial ratios. The last term of council, in 2017 and 2018, municipal tax for residential and multi-residential increases were equalized. And that was achieved through the multi-residential ratio reductions. So what do our tax ratios currently? Based on the 2018 tax policy, the ratios for the commercial, industrial, multi-residential class, farm class are outlined as follows, which is set out on page 67 of your report. A tax ratio determines how much the municipal tax rate in the property tax class will compare to the residential class. So whatever the residential tax rate is, if you're looking at the commercial property class, it is multiplied by the factor of 1.93. So what are some of the possible future directions for tax policy in 2019? Council could look at maintaining the tax ratios in the 3 main non-residential classes at the current levels. Council could also look at reducing all the non-residential tax ratios in a gradual way, possibly giving priority to the multi-residential property class. Council could also look at potentially focusing on lowering the multi-residential tax ratio over a period of time. And finally, another option would be to adjust ratios on an annual basis to mitigate assessment-related tax increases in non-residential property classes, possibly giving priority to the multi-residential property class. It is important to note that all these possible directions are not mutually exclusive of one another. As was done in 2017, 2018, through council direction, we've blended couple of those areas into one, whether it's equalizing the rate increases for multi-residential with residential to lowering multi-residential. There are a lot of tools at council's disposal. So what are some of the key takeaways as we prepare ourselves for the 2019 tax policy report? The annual setting of tax ratios and tax rates determines how the tax pie is to be divided between the property classes. Tax policy has long-term implications. Once a ratio is reduced, it can't automatically be increased. It can be positive or negative, and it may impact the achievement of council's strategies and goals. And finally, the next steps. We are still awaiting the education tax rates. However, we have started our preliminary calculations based on municipal council setting the municipal tax levy on February 12th. The tax policy report will be brought forward in early spring, subject to education tax rates consistent with prior years. When the city receives the report from the ministry outlining the education tax rates, we also are mindful of other tax implications that the province could provide us, such as subclass reduction rules, vacancy rebate rules, capping rules, and restricted levy rules. So as Jim Logan, the tax collector sitting to the left of me, has indicated to me time and time again, it's a very complex item where you can't just look at one component in isolation of another. So at this time, as we've achieved identifying the assessed values of the properties through MPAC, which we reported out through the assessment growth report back in January of 2019, and through the setting of the budget on February 12th, we are almost there, but we are still awaiting some key factors that could influence the tax policy report that we bring forward to you in early spring.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. One question, just so it's clear for our committee. You brought forward this report for information that outlines possible directions that we could consider in the setting of the tax policy. You're not asking us to do that at this time. You're asking us to just keep this in mind. This is a presentation that's a precursor to the discussion that we'll have once you have more information and bring the 2019 tax policy forward.
Through the committee, or through the chair to the committee, consistent with what we've afforded to previous councils, we've decided that the tax policy is fairly intimidating. At least when I started looking at it, I found it fairly intimidating with all the numbers. With previous councils, the best practice that we started to do was provide a report as a precursor or in advance to having that tax policy report provided to committee and to council to give committee and council the opportunity to think about it before it hits the agendas in early spring.
And one other question for the benefit of committee colleagues. Obviously, we have some new members of council. I know it took me some time to even go through this myself when I joined council. Is staff available to meet with individual councillors to go through this? Should they want to go through any of the details of the report and the way the tax policy works today, given that it is incredibly complicated with multiple things layered on top and impacting each other?
From my understanding, through chair to committee, in the past, it has seemed to work out well and informative for the members of council and for administration to sit down with staff, namely Jim Logan, our tax collector, to walk through some of the nuances and the sophistication of the tax policy to get an understanding of what changes to ratios could mean and what the long-term implications are. Plus, he's a very knowledgeable resource when it comes to tax policy within the province of Ontario. I know that the city of Calgary reached out to him not too long ago as they were working on some tax policy items onto themselves for his input.
Thank you. So with that, and knowing that we have some incredible resources available here at the municipality, we can actually have lots of questions now, but there's also an opportunity to meet with our staff on this at any given time. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Collins, if I could. You made reference, Mr. Collins, in your presentation that property taxpayers who have concerns with respect to the values assessed for tax purposes can appeal to the Assessment Review Board. Now, like property owners throughout the city, I get mine from time to time and I look at it and I find it terribly confusing. And I think I'm reasonably adept at such things, but I find that the forms that are there, even the reference points with respect to, they talk about appeals, but I think it probably goes to a more basic issue, and that's the issue of understanding. So my question to you is, as we look at issues around the Assessment Review Board, is there any sense that we can have any impact on either simplifying or talk about tax assessments made easy? Maybe it's tax assessments for dummies. I'd be the first to pick up the book because I get challenged by it. And I think I can speak for other taxpayers who just look at that and say, my goodness, what does that all mean? And you give up. You don't fight it. And I guess, so my question through to you, Chair, aside from allowing me to vent a bit on this issue, is how many Londoners actually appeal, if we have that information, their valuation to the ARB? I'd love to get a sense of that, because I don't, because I give up, but and perhaps everyone around this horseshoe is certainly much smarter than me, and I defer to them, but I don't get it. And I'd just love to get a feeling for, am I alone? And what's the issue with respect to Londoners in terms of appealing? How many are there in any given, in the last tax year, say?
Sure, if you could comment on that, and maybe also comment on the impact that appeals have on the budget, if any.
The appeal process quite often does not involve the Assessment Review Board. There is a request for reconsideration, which goes through MPAC, and that's preliminary to the Assessment Review Board. For most residential properties, that's all that's required. Residential properties are not that complicated to value because there's an active market and houses are selling in areas all over the city all the time. So it's relatively easy to evaluate the valuation on your own property. So very few, I would think, I don't have the exact numbers, but very few residential properties actually will go to the Assessment Review Board. The Assessment Review Board's primary focus will be commercial, industrial, and multi-residential properties. And that's where there is a great deal of activity. And I would also say they also go through a request for reconsideration process as well that can be skipped. But again, they're doing that with MPAC, not with the city. And the Assessment Review Board process is, again, is the property owners' representatives and the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation. The city does have some involvement perhaps with large appeals to be aware of what's going on, and we have to take that into consideration when we set up allowances at year ends for the possible losses on assessment appeals and that kind of thing. But for the average property owner, the issue is not terribly complicated. There is a phase-in process. They reassess every 4 years. People see the market value. Assessment is based on market value. And the question they always ask a property owner is, what would you sell your house for? And quite often they feel that the number they're looking at is a little bit less than that, and they do not get terribly excited.
Sorry, Ms. Barbon, can you comment on the impact that assessment appeals, like what Mr. Logan talked at the end, on the budget and how we account for that in the budget?
Through the chair, so diving into what Mr. Logan said, so we have, as part of the budget, there is a budget for assessment and allowance. So every single year we have a budget. We also have a budget for supplementary taxes, which is the new taxes that are sent through to us during the year on the tax roll. So those are all, so we have an estimate in our budget, and certainly at the end of the year, we look at all of the cases that are out there and any potential appeals that we know of and that we're aware of, and we make a determination. And so generally, there's a percentage that we look year over year for a period of time and make a determination on what that allowance would be required for that year, and then book the entries. So when you see our financial statements at the end of the year, that allowance is there and certainly goes forward. So we have been within our budget the last number of years on a net basis between supplementaries as well as the allowance. So we haven't had an impact, but it's certainly something that we're mindful of, because if you see a number of appeals start to come through and your tax base starts to erode, there are impacts. So we keep a very close eye, and something that Mr. Logan monitors very closely.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. A supplemental to Mr. Logan through your chair, and that is this. So I understand why commercial property owners and multi-residential property owners would appeal, and that would have some fairly dramatic impacts, and I'm certainly familiar with that. And they would have a level of sophistication, typically with, and not surprisingly, with staff to assist and support that process, so that's fine. I'm talking about the average homeowner, and to repeat the chair's comments, and the hundreds who are listening today. And it strikes me that for those of you, who deal with this regularly, it probably is simple. But I look at that and it doesn't feel simple. It doesn't, and again, perhaps I'm just a simple guy, but I'm here to tell you I find it somewhat confusing. But let's just say that's me. So here's my question of you, which I think is the piece that I'm trying to get to. So in terms of the last year when we got our assessments, and I'd like to get a sense how many, if they haven't actually gone to the review, and to your point, would normally go for request for reconsideration. I believe that's what you indicated. How many property homeowners, as opposed to commercial and multi-residential, do we have the numbers for those who appealed and the results in terms of a change in their assessment? And part of that is the exact numbers. Did some go up, actually? I'm just wondering, was that a chance for that to actually raise it? And the numbers in terms of those went down. I guess I'm trying to appeal, Mr. Chair, if somebody feels that it's wrong or not fair, should we be encouraging them through a process like this to exercise their right to for that assessment or reassessment?
Through the chair, yeah, we talk to people quite frequently about problems about their tax bills, why they're concerned about, the increase or whatever, and we explain to them why the increase is occurring. Like when we issue a tax bill, we identify the causes of the change in the taxes. One of those being the reassessment. Now now the specific question you had there about how many people file a request for reconsideration, we don't actually receive that information. That goes to MPAC, the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation. And whenever a person expresses a concern about their tax increase that's related to the value of the property, we don't hesitate to encourage them to go to MPAC to talk to them about it. Now, we do notice that we never see a significant amount of adjustments to assessments. And I would attribute this to the fact that the valuations in the residential class are backed up by so many transactions that it's not difficult for MPAC to talk to people about how they arrived at the value, explain it, and that kind of thing. They actually do it using computerized calculations, using the sales in the area and that kind of thing. I hope that answers your question. If I haven't addressed specifically what you're asking, please let me know.
And I will, Chair, through you, take advantage of a chance to chat again. I think you've taken me down a road that's a little more helpful, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you, and I appreciate the approach that staff are taking with this particular topic. Colleagues who've served on council with me last term know this is a topic that I'm very interested in, and it is relatively complicated, so I think it's good to take it one step at a time in terms of tackling it. I wanted to, for the benefit of everyone who's here, just to go through some of the more common questions that tend to come up. I know that Mr. Logan's familiar with all these things, and I think Mr. Collins as well, based on that presentation. Just in terms of residential rental properties particularly. So there's all kinds of different reasons why properties can be classified as either residential or multi-unit residential. These are the two main categories for residential rental properties. And it can be surprising how those things are actually classified, and then how they're taxed, and also how they're valued. So a lot of these things are changing at the same time. And in the residential class, that includes a lot of rental properties. So for example, fewer than 6 units, things that are organized as condominiums, all kinds of social housing. You know, these are all taxed in the sorry, that one's a multi-unit residential. Those are all a residential. We just dealt with one earlier today, which is a affordable housing bylaw, where we say, even though it's in the multi-unit residential class, we're going to adjust it so that it's taxed as though it's in the residential class. And I just wonder if Mr. Logan could give us a sense of, in terms of freehold condo status, the number of units, and now the year of construction, which is obviously that's a new thing now that we have the new multi-unit residential, what those factors are and what affects how the properties actually get taxed, the rate that they actually get taxed at.
I think what you're referring to is the number of condominiums out there that are actually rented rather than owned by the occupant. So once a building is a building that was formerly multi-residential, it can be converted to the residential class based on the current legislation by turning it into a condominium. As you're aware, that does change the method of valuation and does change the way the property is valued. So there is perhaps an increase in value and a decrease in the tax rate when this happens. The overall effect generally in London, at least, is that the taxes become lower on the property because of that. Now, as to the exact number of, or a good estimate of the number of essentially apartment buildings that have been turned into a condominium, converted to residential class. As you're aware, in the last few years, there have been quite a few conversions. They've slowed down a lot recently, but I don't know off the top of my head the exact number. I can't really give you that right off the top, but I know there's been a lot of conversion that way. And as you're aware, and it's noted in the report, there is the creation of a new multi-residential class, which is going to be effective going into the future, where it's really dictating from the provincial level that all properties, all multi-residential properties are now going to be taxed at essentially the residential rate, and they will also receive the multi-residential valuation, which is lower than the residential valuation. So, so that is a consideration as well. So we have a lot of, I think what Councillors Helmer or Deputy Mayor Helmer is pointing out is that there's a real confusion out there about what is residential, what is multi-residential. It's getting very difficult to distinguish between the two classes, and particularly with what the province has done and with all the condominium conversions. So, and this is one of the big issues I think will come up in the tax policy report, is how does council want to proceed into the future with respect to multi-res versus residential tax rates? And as alluding back to the chair's question before, I don't think there's any expectation there'll be a conclusion of any kind at this moment about where council wants to head. But I can't really give you the exact numbers of how many residential apartment buildings there are now operating in the City of London. I'd have to work at that and gather all the numbers.
Thank you. That's helpful. And in fact, I'm not looking for those kind of figures right now, although that actually sounds interesting. So maybe between now and the next time, I can figure that out with you. But I wanted to just give colleagues a little bit of a sense. So our own social housing buildings, for example, right? So all the buildings that are owned by London Middlesex Community Housing, those are multi-unit residential. So they're taxed at the multi-unit residential tax ratio. And then we, of course, we give a grant to the Middlesex Housing Corporation that's in excess of their property taxes. Similarly, all kinds of nonprofit housing is taxed at the higher rate. So some of them, we have these affordable housing bylaws. We just dealt with one today, where we will adjust that's property by property, right? So there are properties that, they may have not gotten any funding, and so they're providing rents at a lower rate, and they're getting taxed at the multi-unit residential because the structure of their building is that way, and they're freehold in their ownership, they're not condominiums, but they have 7 or more units, and so they're getting taxed at the higher rate. Similarly, all the converted student housing, so all the single-family housing that's divided up, that's all taxed at the residential rate. Those are a lot of rental properties, a lot of rental units, but they're being taxed at the residential rate, even though they've been converted and they're run by property managers who are running it as a business. And so we have these very strange, as Mr. Logan was pointing out, there's a lot of rental properties and they're being taxed in different ways. And now we have the situation where Tricar's new building that they're building right now, that's being built now, it will be taxed if they organize it as an apartment building, not a condo. It'll be taxed at the new multi-unit residential tax ratio. The building they built at Azure, if that was not a condo, I think it is a condo. If it wasn't a condo, it would be taxed at the higher ratio. And they're just, a year apart in construction. Right, so this is the kind of situation that we're trying to navigate. And we are in the fortunate situation that the provincial rules around rent regulation are such that if we do lower the property taxes on multi-unit residential apartment buildings, for current tenants at least, there is a formula for adjusting the rents down. And we have sent out a lot of rent reduction notices in the past few years, I think because of the combination of what's been going on with tax policy, what's been going on with assessments, the conversions that have been happening. In 2017, I think there were 7,800 rent reduction notices that were sent out. So, this is a complicated topic. I'm particularly interested in what's going on with the multi-unit residential tax ratio. I just give everyone a heads up that that's certainly the direction I would like to see us go in, is to start closing the gap, especially now that we have the new multi-unit residential ratio, to bring those things together over time. It doesn't need to be all at once. I think it needs to be a gradual process over time. But I do think that's the direction we need to head in, because you can be in one class or the other just by doing some legal paperwork. Essentially, the purpose of the class has been lost. And now we have these situations where people, based on their knowledge of the tax system, are sort of benefiting or not. And then the date that they built their buildings is affecting sort of what proportion of the tax burden they're covering. So I think we need to resolve it. We've been going in the right direction for quite some time, and we have really good staff advising us on this issue, because I've just talked about the multi-unit and the residential tax ratios. There's other issues around the commercial and the industrial, many of which we haven't got into in depth here, but I just to give a sense of where I'm heading in that, I would like to see us closing that gap gradually over time.
Councillor Kayenbaga.
Through you, Chair, I think that my colleague here just answered a lot of questions that I had. I mean, there are no answers yet. It's really nice to hear someone say that, staff say that. It's a bit confusing on what's considered to be the confusion between multi-residential units. And I had questions too, where I wanted to know what, like, are condos considering that, or rental properties considering that. When we were thinking about the way we tax churches, for example, and the way we tax social housing, is that included in that as well? Since some of the proposals here is to focus on lowering multi-residential tax ratio over the same period, but are they lowered at the same level? Where are we at right now in terms of, because my colleague here, Helmer, just said that there's been a lot of conversions. There was a lot of conversions last year from rentals to condos, and why was that? And why was it more beneficial for people to convert their rentals into condos? Does that mean that we're taxing condos lower than we're taxing rentals, when which would then bring rentals to charge more on renters? Then that means that, I don't know, there's some numbers that are not making sense. And like I think I've talked about this to staff as well, where I've asked how come social housing their taxes is really high. We provide them like $10 million and we take back half of it, 5 million back that we give them into tax, property taxes, and how can we balance that out to make sure that it's working and it's making sense? And like he said, there are people who know the way to play the game, and they keep their taxes lower than others. And yeah, so he answered a lot of questions, but there's definitely an opportunity for us who are new to dig into this and to have more conversation on how we can balance it out. And we need more options, in my opinion, on what direction we should be taking than just this, and definitely more conversation.
Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks for the presentation. I agree. I think the cautious approach is a reasonable and wise approach. I mean, clearly, this is fraught with unintended consequences. The minute you start playing around with these ratios, you start having one going down and one going up. But even that doesn't necessarily hold, because when you look on page 78 at the back of our agenda on Schedule D, from the City of Hamilton, they state that no documented evidence that a reduced multi-residential tax ratio equates to lower rents. I think that's a very important statement. As we move forward. I mean, they go on to say municipalities who have reduced their multi-residential tax ratio have seen rent increases at the same rate or higher than those communities with minimal or no reduction in the multi-residential tax ratio. Then they further say, although Hamilton has a high multi-residential tax ratio, the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Hamilton continues to be among the lowest in Ontario. So this really is a bit of a mug's game here. So I think we have to be very cautious. We may have altruistic motives of, you know, wanting to achieve this, but really achieve something different. So thank you for bringing this forward, because I think it's a very balanced report, and it serves to remind us that we have to be cautious.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much. So when we have a new multi-residential building built now at the new multi-residential rate, essentially we're not hurt by that in terms of taxes. It's just that we would have had an assessment growth that's smaller than it would have been were there not to be were the new multi-residential rate not to be introduced. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. The weighted assessment growth would be a bit less because the tax ratio is a bit lower.
That's good, okay. And we talk about bringing these two together, the residential and the multi-residential rates down to one. What would be, could you remind me, the impact of doing that all at once? How much of an impact would that be on the taxes?
I don't have that exact number right here with me, but that would be something we would look at in the tax policy report. We would provide some information about that. There is some information there about bringing all the classes to one in the report you have, but that's all. To do the calculation you're talking about, I think would be something that would be available more appropriately at the time of the tax policy report.
Okay, thank you. And I guess one of the big concerns is that people renting and people who own homes or condominiums are paying relatively the same fair share for municipal and educational services, and within the complexity that we see here, how do we make sure that happens?
That does happen in that even a person who rents a property, it would be somehow included in the payment of the property owner through the rent payments. I believe that's the question you're asking.
Okay. Actually, it was more a matter of that portion that gets paid. How do we know those are the same? It was interesting for Deputy Mayor Helmer's note that when or sometimes when a building goes from multi-residential to the condominiums, the amount of taxes go down, so that you might conclude from that the people who had previously been renting under multi-residential would be paying more.
What Councilor Helmer was referring to, I believe, was that if the taxes go down, there is a requirement in the Residential Tenancies Act that it be passed on if the tax decrease is greater than a certain percentage. So I think that's what he was referring to.
Okay, well, that's definitely true. I was drawing a different conclusion, was that the tax that was being paid on that one building went down by some quantum, so we could assume that the multi-residential, people paying under the multi-residential rate were actually contributing more than the people who owned it.
Whenever a condominium conversion would occur, the potential effect on the building can be different depending on the type of building, because the building gets valued differently, and the effect of the condominium conversion can vary from building to building. Like a high-end building can behave quite a bit differently from a lower-end building. So you never know for sure exactly, until MPAC has done a reassessment, exactly what the tax effect will be.
Okay, thank you very much. That was my intent to reduce the complexity for me, but it remains. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other comments by colleagues on this? If not, I'm going to make some from the chair. Okay, so I agree with Deputy Mayor Helmer. This is it's going to be a really important debate, and I hope colleagues take the time to learn about it. And I'll give you one really clear reason why. When someone gets their tax bill and they get the brochure in their tax bill, it is not the 2.7% budgeted rate that they necessarily see in that tax bill. It is the rate after we have applied things like our tax policy. And so the numbers can be very different. And that is what people are actually taxed on. It is incredibly complicated, yet incredibly important, because the 2.7% is the size that we have changed the pie. How we divide that pie between the classes is a function of our tax policy. And I will say the reason why we've had such great debates on this in the past is because different colleagues have had different goals and different thoughts on the pacing of those goals. Because when you change one slice of the pie, another piece of the pie actually absorbs that change. And so it's important to realize the consequences of the decision and to pace those decisions in a way that does not create any unforeseen circumstances that perhaps you didn't intend, which is why I think setting a multi-year plan for tax policy, but also having flexibility to deal with the circumstances in each and every given year, given the changes to assessment and the ways that the different classes have appreciated, which creates different pressures on different classes. So although the pie goes up 2.7%, the value of commercial property can go up much faster than residential property, thus creating a much higher tax increase on that property versus the residential. If you shift it back down, you're actually shifting it towards the residential class, and so they're offsetting that. There's ways to make these changes and decisions, but they're very important. They all have multiple impacts, and so I would encourage colleagues to take the time to speak with staff about this, and then when we actually have the debate at this committee, we'll go through it in a way where we have staff available and people can answer questions, and we'll take our time through the debate and discussion, because it will be very, very important, and it has a very significant and clear bottom line impact on Londoners. So I appreciate our staff taking this approach of bringing the documents forward. I think it's worked very well in previous years, and it has set up the kind of parameters of the debate very well for us so that we can make the policy decisions that we need to make, irrespective of all of those components of this that are well beyond our control. So any other discussion? If not, this report is for receipt. Councillor Helmer, Mayor Holder, I think we'll just do this one manually if no one objects. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries.
Chair, may I add through you to staff? Great job.
Thank you. Okay, so we got one more thing on our item. I thought, because I had moved it up in the agenda that we were done it, but we're not. So we have to do it now. So earlier this meeting, we went into camera for interviews related to Eldon House Board of Directors. We reported out that we've now completed those interviews. So those are now complete, and the committee is now in a position to debate and discuss a recommendation for municipal council on the appointment to that board. We are required, well, we can appoint up to 9 members. It is a 9-member board. We have 12 applicants who have applied, and municipal council, or 12 applicants that municipal council asked us to interview. So I would look to the committee for the way you would like to proceed. We do have ballots available. I anticipated, given what we did last time, that would be advantageous for us to do, but I'll look to the committee for the way they'd like to decide. Councillor Hammer?
I'll just look to colleagues. Do you want to rank all of them, or do you want to nominate people and then rank the people in excess of 9, or like we'd rank everybody if we go beyond that? What's your preference? Let's do them all. Why not? It'll take 3 rounds of counting, right, to get down to the 9?
It will, yes, and I think that that's probably manageable. We'll have to wait till the counting's done, but I'm sure everybody's okay with that.
Okay.
So we have ballots prepared. We can distribute them. If anybody has any comments, it would be advantageous to make those comments. You can do them in advance of the ranking, or you can do them after the ranking. It's up to you. But if you have thoughts or comments you want to make on the candidates, you can do that now. Otherwise, I'll let you rank your ballots.
Chair, point of clarification, please, for the
Yes,
vote.
sir.
Is it being suggested that we rank all 12 so that we don't give undue weight to others? So we're going to do 1 to 12?
Yes, I would ask if you could rank all 12. That would be advantageous, so you don't have any unintended consequences on the ones you don't rank.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Just while we're waiting for the results to be tallied, I wanted to say, I think doing the interview process with 12 candidates, it certainly took a fair amount of time, but I am reassured that we have amazing groups of people coming forward to serve on these organizations. I think it also shows, Councillor, I'm glad he's still here, the value of doing the interviews. Like whether it's a committee of council who's doing the interviews for these appointments in the future, or, we strike some other way of doing it. But I think actually talking to people in person is a really big value add compared to a piece of paper. And I think if we can spread out the appointments so they're not all happening at the same time, and we can take our time to do interviews with people. It's certainly been my experience doing the interviews in the past for the Hydro Board, for example, or the Airport Authority, or, a variety of positions we were filling on a vacancy became available basis. When we take our time with that, I think we're getting a really good results, and we're appointing really great people to those positions. So I wanted to all the applicants, obviously there's 12 applicants and only 9 positions, but we really had a great group of people apply. And I'm sure Eldon House is in very good hands, regardless of how this turns out tonight.
Mr. Mayor.
Well, since we're on the topic of topicking, I'm not sure I disagree. If there's a caution is when you get 40+ individuals applying for a certain number of positions and time being finite, there has to be a way to do this. I would say there has to be a consistency, though. We either do it for all or we do it for none. So I think there's got to be something that, so we certainly did it here with Eldon House, and I agree. I think you get a great strong feel for the candidates when you go through a personal interview, because you get a sense of their interpersonal strengths and I might even say their enthusiasm or lack of it or whatever it might be, but you get a flavor for the individuals better than a piece of paper would ever give you. My caution would only ever be, we then ultimately decide to do it for all, or we can decide that none. But I think focusing on 1 or 2 committees is, it might be case specific, but I like the process of the interactions. And I prefer it to be, if we're going to do it for all. I say that a little bit reservedly, but I'm mindful that if you're going to do that, and it might well be that subcommittees are the ultimate way to do it. But then you only get a flavor from a subcommittee as to and that's, so unless they're going to recommend a slate, and maybe that's some of the things that we have to consider if we're going to entrust a subcommittee to do that, then they might put forward a slate of individuals just to make this practical, or else it'd get pretty, I fear it might get unwieldy. Otherwise, the suggestion's a fair one.
Thank you for the comments. I certainly concur. It was a great interview, and I know we're endeavoring to make improvements to the process, and I think all of these things are absolutely for sure up for discussion. The thing I would add is I find value also when the boards and agencies give us a sense of their needs for individuals on their board, whether if they're going through a CEO, someone with HR experience would be valuable during that time, but maybe not others. So I think there's definitely ways we can improve the overall process, but I did find as well great value in the interviews and learning more about the candidates. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Chair. And of course, when we talk about the possible new processes at the governance working committee, I'm sure that what we learned today and for the previous interviews we've done will help a lot.
Well, I'd definitely say there was lots of learning that happened for sure through the processes. I don't usually allow us to just kind of fill time with comments, but I know that we're counting ballots, so we're very close. Anybody want to talk about tax policy some more? I'm just kidding. Okay, and as an update, we think we've fixed the delay in the computer system, so we are going to do, when we get to the point of a next motion, we are going to attempt to do that on screen, see if we'll be a little bit of a beta test of whatever they've tried to fix on this. Okay, Clerk Saunders has the results from the elections committee here. I don't know if you can make some comments on this.
Through Mr. Chair, after, on the fourth round, we were able to determine the top 9 candidates based on the ballots that were submitted by Corporate Services Committee, and thanks to Jeannie and Robert for running that through for us. I'll scroll through once Miss Westlake Power has all the names.
Yes, she appreciates they're in a different order than she has on her screen, so it's a little bit of a lineup here.
So we're currently showing round 1. At that round, Mr. Herod was eliminated from the election. Round 2, Elsie Nagel was removed from the election. Round 3, Julia Ruzinak was removed, which left 9 individuals in the race.
Does any colleagues need that scrolled through again? No? Okay, we have a motion prepared as we proceeded with last time for those 9. I'd look to see if anybody wants to move that or has any discussion on it. Councillor Hillier has moved the top ranked 9 as the new Eldon House Board. Is there a seconder? Councillor Helmer, discussion. Seeing none, we're going to do that on the screen.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 0.
Okay, unless we're actually under deferred matters, additional business, we deferred it to this point in the billing. Is there any other deferred matters or additional business? Seeing none, I would look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Kaibaga, seconded by Councillor Hillier. All those in favor? We're adjourned. Thank you very much.